Welcome to Windows Presentation Foundation, Accessing Data with WPF. In this screencast, I'll introduce several strategies for working with data in WPF. Just about every application needs to access data. Since WPF is a rich client technology, you have quite a few choices as to where your data will live. It's actually not really a single decision you're going to make, but rather a series of decisions. The first decision is whether you want to store data locally or on a server remote to the application. This decision will be influenced by what type of data you're storing and how you expect your application to be used. If you're just storing a few application or user settings, or if you have a requirement that your application is usable offline, you probably want to store your data locally. If you want your application to access data that's being used by others, and you need to ensure that the user always has the freshest data available, then your data has to be located at some shared location, probably exposed via web services. Of course, you could also go with a hybrid approach in which data is synchronized between a local copy and a remote copy, and that way you get the best of both worlds. Once you've decided whether your data will be stored locally or remotely, your next decision must address storage mechanism. Local or remote, the most common choice is a relational database. Locally, you might also choose to use XML to store data, and on the server, your data might be stored in an enterprise information system, perhaps a CRM system or ERP or a supply chain management system. Once you've decided where the data lives, you have another decision. How are you going to access the data? If your data lives on a remote server, then your choices are obviously going to be limited to different types of wire protocols and web service technologies. WPF has built-in support for both ASP.NET or ASMX and Windows Communication or WCF-based web services. Also, recently there's been a trend towards REST-based services or representational state transfer. Thanks to the rich networking and HTTP support in .NET, WPF applications can readily access these types of services as well. If your data lives locally, then you have a lot of options. A relatively new option is Language Integrated Query, or LINQ. LINQ comes in several flavors. For relational data, you can use LINQ to SQL or LINQ to Entities. And for XML, you can use LINQ to XML. If you want to use an older yet proven technology, you can use ADO.NET for accessing relational data, and the types and the interfaces in the system.xml namespace for accessing XML. There are a lot of choices when it comes to data access. Obviously, it isn't practical to demonstrate every single one of them in a short video like this one, so I'm going to focus on a very common scenario: local relational storage. I'm also going to assume data storage in SQL Server Express, because all of the options I'll discuss will work with this database. What we'll see is a quick demo of the easy to use, the new, and the tried and true. LINQ to SQL has now been available for several years. It's really easy to use, but it is Microsoft SQL Server. What we'll see is a quick demo of the easy to use, the new, and the tried and true. LINQ to SQL has now been available for several years. It's really easy to use, but it is Microsoft SQL Server specific. LINQ to Entities is the newest of these technologies, and it's more flexible since the entity model adds an extra layer of abstraction between the database and your code. That extra layer gives it the ability to work with other types of databases, but it also adds a bit more complexity. Finally, the tried and true, and that's good old ADO.NET, which is a good choice if you're targeting older machines or if you really do want to write the Transact SQL data access code yourself. So let's take a look at an example of data access using these different types of approaches. As you can see, I've already started a project, a WPF application in Visual Studio, and I've laid out the user interface, so that's all ready for us. And the only thing I want to draw your attention to here is the fact that we have a list box. And this list box is what we're going to use for data binding and to display the results of our data access. So the first thing that I'm going to demonstrate is LINQ to SQL. And so the way to add a LINQ to SQL data connection is simply to select the project, and I'll right click and then select Add New Item. And from the data category, I want to add something called LINQ to SQL classes, and we'll call this pubs. Now I'm going to get a blank screen, but it's going to suggest that I open Server Explorer. So I'll do just that, And then I can see that I've got a pubs connection. And in the pubs connection, I've got all these tables which I can drag over to the design surface. And not only does it put the tables there, but it also recognizes the various relationships. So when you've got foreign key relationships between tables, it can recognize those. We can add views. So for instance, I think we have a single view here called title view. Let's bring that over. Stored procedures could be imported as well, and they would show up as methods in the resulting data context. But we've got enough for our purposes here. We'll go ahead and close that and close Server Explorer and build up the application. And now we have a LINQ to SQL classes ready to use, right? It's really straightforward. How am I going to actually use it? Well, if somebody clicks on the LINQ to SQL button, what I want to do is I want to begin by creating an instance of the data context. And before I do that, one more thing that I just about forgot is that because I'm going to be doing LINQ to SQL and LINQ to entities in the same project, you normally wouldn't do that, but because I am, it could get confused based on the entity names because they're coming from the same database. So to make sure that the LINQ to SQL and LINQ to entities generated classes stay separate, I'm going to add a little bit to the namespace here. So we'll just add .SQL to the pubs DML. So that way I can be very clear about specifically requesting the LINQ to SQL version of the types. Okay, so now I can get back to it and say using SQL.pubs data context, and we'll call it DB, and we just call the constructor for pubs data context. We don't need to supply any configuration information or connection string or anything like that because it's all stored in app-config. Now in that, I simply query for whatever I want. So if I want to get all titles, I can do from t in db.titles. I could add a where clause if I wanted to filter, but in this case I'll just say select t.title1, which is the actual value that or the actual column name from the titles table. By selecting title 1, I'm creating an enumeration of string values, which I can easily bind to the list box. So listbox data dot items source is going to just be equal to all titles, and that's it. So relatively few lines of code. And when I invoke this, you'll see that we can click on LINQ to SQL and get a list of titles coming from the pubs database. Fairly straightforward. Now, LINQ to SQL has the limitation that it only works for SQL Server. It's very easy to use and very straightforward, but you can't use it for other types of databases. Now, LINQ to entities, on the other hand, it's more flexible and therefore a little more complex, but because of that flexibility, you can actually use it with other types of databases. For our purposes here, we're going to keep things real simple and use the same database, in fact, invoke the same functionality. But I'll do that by selecting Add, New Item, and again, we want to filter by the data category, only this time I'm going to create an ADO.NET Entity Data Model. So we'll click Add, and the process here is a little different. Instead of being taken straight to a design surface where I can drag and drop the tables and views and stored procedures, it's actually going to take me through a wizard. So the first thing, it asks me, what do I want the model to contain? Well, I'd like to generate it from the database because that'll save me some time. I want to use the pubs connection string because that's perfectly fine. And then I want to, what it's really doing here is it's going to use this data connection, but it's going to save a new copy with all of the entity specific stuff, and it's going to save it in app-config as the pubs entities connection string. So that's good. We'll click Next. Now we get to choose which database objects. So instead of, again, dragging and dropping them, we just select whatever we want. So if we want tables, if we want views, if we want stored procedures, we just simply select there. And then finally we define a namespace. Pubs model works just fine. So we'll go ahead and click Finish. All right, and this, if we zoom out, you can sort of see that it has generated a view that's not unlike that used for LINQ to SQL classes, but this is an entity data model as opposed to the LINQ to SQL classes. It's a good idea to rebuild at this point just to make sure that everything that was generated for the entity model works and builds successfully. And now we can invoke that data model, and I'll do that as a response to the user clicking on the LINQ to entities button. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is going to create an instance of the pubs data context, or rather the pubs entities. I should say it's very similar to what it looked like when I was creating the data context, but in this case it's a new instance of pubs entities. Again, no need to specify anything because all the configuration data and initial parameters are being stored in the data model. And then I can actually just copy, because the code is so similar. We want to get titles from P, and the only other thing is, because of what it's done to the entity model, we don't get title 1, we simply get title. And that's it. So very, very similar. And of course, with this simple an example, entity models appear to be, and in fact are, fairly straightforward to work with. They're just more powerful than LINQ to SQL. Okay, so let's try running this, and we should be able to now click on LINQ to entities, and we get the same list, only now we're using the entity data model as opposed to here we're using LINQ to SQL. So the final method of accessing the same data is the tried and true ADO.NET. Now before we go any further, I'd like to go out and open the app config file and point out that I have a connection here, string here, called pubs.cs. I'll go ahead and copy that. And it's just a standard system.data.SQL client connection string. It's a little different than the one that was created for our entity model that is of type system.data.entityClient. Okay, so app config is ready to go. We just have to reference it. And so what we'll do is we'll say that we want to first retrieve the connection string, and we'll do that with a call to string cs for connection string, configuration manager dot connection strings, and then there's the named connection string, and we want the actual connection string itself. By the way, configuration manager is not going to be added to a WPF application or not going to be visible by default. You actually have to go into add references and add system.configuration. So if you're doing this and you can't find configuration manager, it's because you need to add this right here. Okay, so next up we're going to then create a empty list of type string. Just gives us a place to store our titles. And then we'll create a using statement where we create a new connection, and we'll initialize it with a connection string. And then we have to do everything sort of manually here, so we actually have to open the connection, and then we have to create a SQL command. And we do that with a call to connection.create command. And then we'll set the command text. And the command text is going to be equal to select title from dbo.titles. So we're actually having to write out the transact SQL ourselves. Finally, getting a SQL data reader with a call to execute reader, and then looping through the results. Once we have all the results, we'll just data bind to listbox data. And that's it. So it's certainly more code than we saw with the other approaches, but remember, in this case, we're writing all the code ourselves as opposed to relying on this generated data model, either a linked SQL classes or an entity data model. All right, so let's execute this after fixing one typo there for reader gets string. And now we should have ADO.NET giving us the same values, the same results as LINQ to entities and LINQ to SQL. So we've seen the same information, but getting it 3 different ways: LINQ to SQL, LINQ to entities, and finally ADO.NET. Thanks very much for your time.